Today we're counting down the weirdest tech products big brands actually made and rating each one from 1 to 10 on the weirdness scale. We'll start with products that are just a little odd and work our way up to the ones that feel like they were approved at the end of a very bad meeting. Let's get into it. Starting off gently, we have the Nintendo Love Tester. This was a product from long before Nintendo became the gaming giant we know today. Back then, the gaming company was still experimenting. It made toys, novelty gadgets, and all sorts of weird little ideas to see what might stick. And one of those ideas was a device that claimed to measure romantic chemistry. Two people would each hold one end of it, and the machine would supposedly tell you how compatible you were, which is obviously nonsense, but that's also why it's such a perfect starting point. Because this product is weird, but it's not chaotic. It's more like early evidence that Nintendo has always had a strange streak. Even now, Nintendo still feels like the one company that can release something completely bizarre on paper and somehow make it work. A cardboard kit, a ring you can exercise with, a handheld with 2 screens, that energy has always been there. So the Love Tester gets a 1 out of 10. It's weird, but in a fairly harmless and playful way. Next up is the Sony Rolly, which feels like the kind of product you'd invent if you locked a music player, a robot, and a Bluetooth speaker in the same room. The Rolly was this small egg-shaped music device that could play songs, move around, light up, and dance. And I mean literally dance. It had moving parts, spinning rings, and built-in animations that tried to turn music playback into a whole performance. Now, to Sony's credit, this thing was memorable. You wouldn't forget seeing one, but that's also part of the problem, because once the novelty wears off, you're left with a very simple question. Who was this actually for? It wasn't the best speaker, it wasn't the best music player, and it definitely wasn't the future of robotics. It was just a dancing gadget. And that's why it's so interesting. Sony has always been at its best when it makes cool, clear, and focused tech. The Walkman made sense, PlayStation made sense, great cameras and headphones, they make sense. But the Rolly feels like Sony giving itself permission to be weird for the sake of being weird. So it gets a 2 out of 10. It's strange, niche, but also kind of charming. The Samsung Galaxy Beam was a smartphone with a built-in projector. And honestly, the first time you hear that, it almost sounds brilliant. Because built-in projectors are one of those ideas that always sounds more useful in theory than they do in real life. You imagine projecting films into a wall, sharing presentations anywhere, turning any room into a mini cinema, and then reality kicks in. Because once you put a projector inside a phone, you run into all the obvious problems. Battery life takes a hit, brightness is limited, the phone gets bulkier, and the actual number of people who need a projector in their pocket at all times is probably not huge. And that's what makes the Galaxy Beam such a classic weird tech product. And Samsung, to be fair, has always been more than willing than most companies to try strange hardware. Curved phones, foldable styluses, they'll try the things that brands want. So the Galaxy Beam gets a 3 out of 10. It's weird, but with just enough logic to almost get away with it. The Nokia N-Gage is one of my favourite weird tech products ever because it makes perfect sense on paper and looks completely ridiculous in practice. This was Nokia's attempt to combine a phone and a handheld game console into one device, which, to be fair, today, it sounds quite normal. In fact, it sounds ahead of its time, and that's because it was. Phones and gaming did eventually merge. Nokia was not wrong about that. The problem was the actual product. The design was awkward, the layout was strange, and worst of all, to make a phone call you had to hold the thing sideways against your face, which made every user look like they were talking to a taco. Taco. However you pronounce it. That one detail alone was enough to destroy any chance the device had of looking cool. And that's the tragedy of the N-Gage. Underneath the weird exterior, there was a genuinely smart idea. Nokia could see where mobile tech was going. It just got there in the least graceful way possible. So the N-Gage gets a 4 out of 10. It was a bold idea, a very strange product, and one of the most iconic design misfires in tech history. Now we get to the Apple QuickTake 100, and this one is fascinating because the weirdness here is not just the product itself, it's what the product says about Apple. Today, Apple feels extremely controlled. The lineup is tight, the design language is consistent, every product feels like it belongs inside the same universe. But in the 1990s, Apple was a much messier company. It was still experimenting, still trying different categories. It was still figuring out what Apple really was. And one of the stranger results of that era was this. A standalone digital camera. It wasn't a phone camera, no software, an actual Apple camera. And it looked nothing like modern Apple. It was beige, chunky, slightly awkward, It looked more like office equipment than a premium consumer device, and that's why it's so interesting. Because the QuickTake doesn't feel like a bad product, it feels like a product from an alternate timeline. A version of Apple that kept going deeper into random hardware categories instead of narrowing down and becoming the company we now know. So the QuickTake gets a 5 out of 10. It's not absurd, but definitely strange enough to make you stop and stare. Now this is where things start getting properly niche. The Twitter Peak was a dedicated handheld device built just for Twitter. It wasn't a whole pitch, there was no smartphone, no mini computer, just Twitter. And this is one of the products that immediately tells you exactly when it was made, because it came from that era when social media was exploding. Smartphones were still evolving and companies were convinced that single-purpose internet gadgets might still become their own category. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Because once smartphones got good enough, products like this stopped making any sense. Why would you carry a second device that only does one internet thing when your phone can already do all of them? That's what makes the Twitter Peak so weird in hindsight. It wasn't just niche, it was built around a very temporary idea of how people would use technology. It was basically like a time capsule from a moment when the future still felt up for grabs. So this gets a 6 out of 10. A dedicated Twitter machine is exactly the kind of thing that sounds futuristic for 6 months and ridiculous forever after. The Polaroid Pogo was a pocket printer designed to print photos straight from your phone. And to be fair, that doesn't sound too weird by itself. In fact, in today's world of mini printers and retro photo trends, it almost sounds normal. But what makes the Pogo weird is the timing, the branding, and the very specific type of tech optimism behind it. This was one of those products built around the idea that people wanted instant physical printing from their digital lives, but before the whole experience felt smooth enough to become mainstream cool again. So instead of feeling elegant, it felt like a gadget from a strange transition period. The gap between old Polaroid nostalgia and the smartphone era. The company trying to stay relevant by attaching itself to a future it didn't fully control. And that's why it's interesting. Not because it was a terrible idea, but because it feels like tech caught between two identities. Not quite old school, not quite modern, just stuck in the middle. So the Polaroid Pogo gets a 7 out of 10. It's odd, transitional, and very specific to its moment. The LG DoublePlay was a smartphone with a second smaller screen built into the middle of a split keyboard. And even describing it sounds awkward, which tells you a lot. This was one of those products designed to solve a very specific problem from a very specific era. At the time, phone makers were experimenting with how much people wanted to multitask on mobile. Physical keyboards were still hanging on. Touchscreens were taking over. Nobody fully knew what the best layout was yet. So LG tried to do it all at once. You got a touchscreen on top, then a slide-out keyboard, and then another little screen in the middle of that keyboard for extra functions. Which sounds ambitious, but also slightly desperate. Because instead of making one clean decision, this product makes every decision. A touchscreen, a keyboard, and a second screen. The result feels less like a confident product and more like a hardware brainstorm that accidentally made it to market. So the LG DoublePlay gets an 8 out of 10. It's not just weird to look at, but weird in that very specific way only experimental phones from the early 2010s could be. The Amazon Fire Phone is one of the most fascinating failures in modern tech because it came from a company that should have had every advantage. Amazon had money, and it also had scale, infrastructure, an ecosystem, and brand recognition. And yet the Fire Phone still ended up to feel deeply strange. Part of that was the hardware itself. It leaned heavily on gimmicks like dynamic perspective effects and motion-based features that looked flashy but didn't really solve anything meaningful. It was trying so hard to feel futuristic that it forgot to feel useful. But the bigger issue was the entire concept. Because at its core, the Fire Phone felt less like a phone built for users and more like a phone built for Amazon. It was a device designed to pull you deeper into Amazon's world. More shopping, more services, more lock-in. And people could feel that. That's what makes it weird. Not just that it failed, but that it never really felt like a natural move for Amazon in the first place. Kindle, that makes sense. A smart speaker, it makes sense. A full phone, that was always going to be a much harder sell. So the Fire Phone gets a 9 out of 10. It's a big company with big ambition, but a very weird result. And at number 1, we have a product that feels so specific, so awkward, and so completely trapped in its own era that it almost doesn't feel real. This is the Sony eVilla. This was an internet appliance from the early 2000s, a device meant to bring the web into your home in a simple, friendly way. It looked a bit like a clunky all-in-one touchscreen computer, but the whole concept was built around the idea that people needed a special appliance just to access online services. And that is what makes it such a perfect number one, because it captures a very particular kind of tech weirdness. The moment when the internet was clearly important, but companies still had no idea what form the future would actually take. So instead of building flexible computers or waiting for phones and tablets to mature, some brands created these strange in-between devices. The eVilla feels like a future that just never happened. And that's why this gets the full 10 out of 10 on the weirdness scale. Because it isn't just weird, it feels like a dead branch of evolution. So these were some of the weirdest tech products that big brands have ever made. And honestly, this is why I love looking back at old tech. Not just for the products that changed the world, but for the ones that absolutely did not. So now what I want to know from you, which one of these was the weirdest? And most importantly, which weird tech product did I miss that deserves to be on a part 2? Drop it in the comments and I'll go through the best ones. And if you've enjoyed this, subscribe because there are way more strange gadgets, forgotten tech experiments and corporate disasters hiding out there than you'd think. Thank you for watching and I will see you in the next video. If this one does well, because it probably won't.